Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the weekly Parsha discussion. This week we will be discussing the portion Beshalach, and so we'll be taking a look at the people of Israel actually leaving Egypt, crossing the Yam Suf. We'll discuss a little bit about their beginnings in the wilderness with the manna and take a look at the battle with Amalek. So to start out today, first thing I'd like to do is give to tzedakah. So we'll go ahead and do that. And then we'll recite the blessings of the Torah. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. V'ha'arev na Adonai Eloheinu, et divrei Toratecha, b'finu ufi amcha b'Yisrael. V'niech anachnu, v'tzetzeinu, v'tzetzei amcha b'Yisrael. Kulanu yodeh shmecha, lomdei Toratecha lishma. Baruch atah Adonai, hamlamed Torah le'emo Yisrael. Amen. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim, v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai, noten ha'Torah. Amen. So as I said, this week's Parsha will be Beshalach, and we're going to discuss a little bit about what's actually going on here, what the deeper meaning is, some of the interpretations from the sages, and then perhaps most importantly, how that ties into our daily lives and how we actually incorporate what we've learned and what we've gleaned from this week's Parsha. So as I said, really what we'll be taking a look at is the people of Israel leaving Egypt, crossing the Yam Suf, the parting of the Yam Suf, and then the crossing, and the beginnings of the time in the wilderness. So we start off in the book of Exodus, chapter 13, verse 7. And the verse reads, "It came to pass when Pharaoh let the people go, that Hashem did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines." And so this idea of avoiding the land of the Philistines is interesting. And we might first infer that there's a greater risk attempting to cross the Yam Suf with the Egyptians behind the people of Israel. And then, we'll see later on the battle with Amalek. And so why do we need to avoid the Philistines? And Midrash Rabbah has an interesting interpretation of this. States that the tribe of Ephraim actually left Egypt 30 years earlier, prior to this, to the Exodus. And at that time when they fled, they encountered the Philistines, and 300,000 people were killed. And so the concern was that if the people of Israel saw this when they left, when they went to the land of the Philistines and saw the remains of those who had passed 30 years earlier, that they would return to Eretz Mitzrayim. And so in order to avoid that, Hashem led them away from the land of the Philistines. And then we continue on to verse 18. And it says, "So Hashem led the people around by way of the desert to the Red Sea, and the children of Israel were armed when they went up out of Egypt." And so there's an interesting word here, this word hamushim. In the text it says hamushim. And so this is a word that has various interpretations. Obviously, the literal interpretation, but Rashi has an interesting interpretation of this. That being that this is related to the idea that 1 out of 5 of the people of Israel were left, and that the word Hamishim being related to 5, and Rashi states that the others had died during the darkness because they didn't want to leave Eretz Mitzrayim. And so that's an interesting interpretation. Also, taking a look at Midrash, another interpretation is that there were 5 times as many people leaving Eretz Mitzrayim because of converts. You had 5 times as many people as the people of Israel fleeing Eretz Mitzrayim as well, because they were converts. So I felt that was an interesting take on it. So we continue on, and so we see that that we have the pillar of cloud that is guiding the way for the people of Israel by day, and the pillar of fire at night. And we continue to chapter 14 with the Egyptians in pursuit of the Jewish people. And verse 15 says, Hashem said to Moshe, "Why do you cry out to me? Speak to the children of Israel and let them travel." And there's this reoccurrence of Moshe and the people of Israel continuously crying out to Hashem. And in a sense, this almost has this really displays this idea of doubt and the people of Israel not having faith. So we question: is it even plausible that Hashem wouldn't know what's going on? He would obviously see the plight of the people of Israel, and we would think that they would be aware of this, being that they saw the miracles of the 10 plagues and their deliverance from Eretz Mitzrayim. Why would they cry to Hashem? It's almost as if saying, you're not paying attention to us. You're not seeing what's going on with us, when it was completely obvious that Hashem knows exactly what's going on. And so there's an interesting interpretation to this, that Hashem is absolutely aware of what is going on with the people of Israel. But when he replies, "Why do you cry?" what he's saying is there's a time for prayer, and there's a time for speaking with Hashem and reaching out to Hashem. But now is not that time. And what that tells us is that we need to have a balance in our life. There is a time for prayer and a time for speaking with Hashem, but it isn't all the time. It's not something that consumes our life in every aspect of it, although it may be the most important. We have other things that need attention in our life. We have our families and our homes and our communities and all the goings on in daily life. It's not okay for us to just totally envelop and consume ourselves in prayer and not be aware of the world outside of us. And so that's what Hashem is saying. He's saying that, you have other things that need to be done. You have the Egyptians chasing you. You need to make your way into the wilderness, and now is not the time for prayer. You can't just close yourself off and rely solely on your cries to Hashem, that you need to put your own energy, your own effort into it. And you need to take care of everything that's in your life, not just prayer. And there's a balance there of what is going to receive the focus. So we'll get into this a little bit more at the end of our discussion, when we kind of wrap up everything that's going on. But we continue on, and I want to revisit this idea of the cloud, the pillar of cloud, and the pillar of fire. And so we continue to verse 20, and verse 20 says, "And he came between the camp of Egypt and the camp of Israel, and there were the cloud and the darkness, and it illuminated the night, and one did not draw near the other all night long." And so this is an interesting idea where here we're mentioning the cloud and the darkness versus the idea that it illuminated the night and allowed people to see. And Rashi interprets this as the difference between what this pillar did for the people of Egypt versus what the pillar did for the people of Israel. For the people of Egypt, it created darkness and a cloud that obstructed their pursuit and obstructed their way. Whereas for the people of Israel, it provided illumination and allowed them to see the light. So we have this singular entity, this one pillar, that depending on who is encountering it, there is a different outcome. And this is interesting because this is something that we see in our daily lives. We see a singular event that approaches or the people encounter throughout their lives with different impacts, different interpretations. And we'll revisit this idea of the difference in people as we continue. But it's important to note that in a singular event, we can see either darkness and obstruction, or we can see light and guidance. And I think that this is distinctly tied to the idea of the animal soul versus the divine soul. What is encountering this event, and how is that going to react to it? We know that the animal soul is definitely concerned with self-preservation, and even beyond that, self-gratification. And so in that sense of protection, it'll see darkness and obstacles in order to find a way to survive and satisfy itself. Whereas the divine soul sees the events that are going on and recognizes the divine essence, the spark of Hashem that exists in everything, and sees that light and is drawn to that light. And so we see this difference, this distinction between the singular event that is interpreted different ways depending on what's encountering it. So we continue on to the parting of the Yam Suf. We're going to take a pretty in-depth look at this. Verse 21 says, "And Moshe stretched out his hand over the sea, and Hashem led the sea with a strong east wind all night, and he made the sea into dry land, and the waters split." So this idea of the waters dividing is interesting. First, I want to call attention to specifically that's what noted here is waters, not the water, not the Yam Suf, but the waters. And so there's an interpretation that this means all of the waters around the world, whether it was here during the Exodus, or if you're talking about waters that were across the globe in Asia and North America, all around the world, the waters, plural, being divided. And it's held that this even includes water that's in a cup or in a bowl. The water there would have parted. And I heard an interesting interpretation to this from a rabbi who said this is really the first example of social media, or one of the first examples of social media, in that nowadays we go onto social media, we put up a post, and it seems to travel around the world like wildfire. We put out a post, and the next minute somebody on the other side of the world reads it, and somebody right next door reads it, and just all over the place. And so this is really an example of that, in that the waters divided all around the world, as if to tell and make a post to everyone all around the world, this is what's happening, so that people in Asia, people in North America, people in Africa and South America, all around the world would know that this is what's going on. And that's what's meant by the waters and why it's plural, because it refers to the waters everywhere. So we continue on. And verse 22 says, Then the children of Israel came into the midst of the sea on dry land, and the waters were to them as a wall from their right and from their left. So it's interesting, this idea of the people of Israel being in the midst of the sea and on dry land. So which was it? Were they in the midst of the sea or were they on dry land? You theoretically couldn't have both at once. And so there's an understanding that essentially at the highest level, the waters parted once the waters got to a certain height. And I've read different interpretations, whether it's to their neck level or up to their nose. The people of Israel waded that far into Yam Suf, and then once it reached that level, then the waters parted. And this is an interesting message for us. We may think that things get difficult for us, things get hard. But what it teaches us is that we should always have faith in Hashem, and the idea that Hashem will fulfill the covenant that has been made with us, as long as we continue to have faith and pursuing that path. And so our daily trials and tribulations are like the Yam Suf, and that we still need to move forward and move ahead despite those things. And when it, even if it gets to seem like it's the worst that it could possibly be, that we can no longer go any further, we should have faith that Hashem will be there for us, that Hashem will support us. But at the same time, that we need to put our own dedication and our own effort to, as I said before. And with that, we will have the support of Hashem, and Hashem will part the waters and clear the obstacles and different things in our way. But it's also important to note that that doesn't necessarily mean that Hashem will remove any obstacles or impediments in the way that we would hope. Hashem works in ways that we don't understand, but what's important for us to remember is that Hashem works for our own sake and for our good and for our success on a larger picture. It doesn't mean this particular obstacle will be managed the way that we want. For example, perhaps maybe in someone's life, their finances may be difficult, and they're faithful, and they turn to Hashem and say, I don't have the money to pay for this bill. If you could just get rid of this bill, then everything would be fine. But we need to understand that just because that's the specific thing that we hope for from Hashem doesn't mean that that's what Hashem is there for. What it means is that Hashem will look out for the overall good, and perhaps for your overall good is the fact that you're not able to pay that bill. So what do you learn from that? You learn from that you need to manage your budget a little bit better, or plan a little bit better, or save a little bit. And ultimately, that allows you to be a better person. In contrast, if Hashem had just made it so that bill no longer existed, you didn't really learn, you didn't really grow. So in effect, you're enabling and doing harm to that person. So our idea of what's best for us might not be the same as what Hashem's idea is for us. But as long as we continue to have faith and follow the path of Hashem, ultimately we will be taken care of and in the hands of Hashem. Okay. And then I want to call attention to the idea of the walls of water. And This is mentioned 2 times in verse 22 and then in verse 29, and there's an interesting distinction here. In the first spelling in verse 22, we have Homa, and then the same word in verse 29, Homa, but with a different spelling. And in verse 29, it's interesting that because of the letter that's missing, this can actually be read as Hema, which is anger. And so what's the cause for this different spelling between the two? In the first instance, we have a wall, and then in the second one, we have anger. And this goes to the idea of 4 different groups that were presented at the edge of Yam Suf. And we'll describe the 4 groups a little bit later in this discussion. But one of the groups was the group that was led by Nachshon. So this group, this was from the people of Yehuda. This group, their option, the option that they saw most fit, was to sacrifice themselves in the name of Hashem and go into the sea, despite the drowning. That was the path that they chose. Whereas the other groups weren't willing to make this sacrifice. And so this is where the word anger can come from. This generates the anger because, again, so much of this Parsha is focused on questioning Hashem and trying to understand, why the reason for this, and won't you help us? After everything that Hashem has done for the people of Israel. And so then we get to this idea of anger. And there's a lengthy discussion about the angel of the Yam Suf who wanted to destroy the Jewish people, the people of Israel, because of this questioning, of this doubt in Hashem, and also because of a covenant that was made with the waters at the time of creation. But it was ultimately this group, led by Nachshon, that allowed for the salvation of the people of Israel. So that's where this idea of the word, the different spelling, it's an interpretation of how it could be interpreted as anger as well. Another thing that's important to note along this line is what is actually going on with Yam Suf here. And it's important to note that essentially what we're looking at is the Yam Suf going against its nature. And so this ties into it as well with the people of Yehuda. So we understand that this idea of self-preservation is very important, and that people will go to almost any length for self-preservation. And we've discussed this with previous parshas about how important that is. But we have the people of Yehuda that were willing to sacrifice themselves. And so, in a sense, they were going against their nature of self-preservation, in order to follow the will of Hashem. And so, like Yam Suf, they were going against their nature. There's also discussion that this is what Yosef did. And so there's a lot of discussion that the reason why the Yam Suf parted, and it's discussed in this Parsha, is that we had the people of Israel had the coffin of Yosef as they were leaving. And Yosef is another character who went against the nature. And what this was that we discussed in previous parshas was that Yosef was in the land of Egypt, Eretz Mitzrayim, without any support, without any of his family, and he resisted all the temptations and overcame those. He went against the nature of the land. And so with these two ideas, the people of Yehuda going against their nature, of self-preservation, carrying the coffin of Yosef, who went against the nature of the land that he was in, was just like the sea, and in fact maybe even a sign to the sea that even though this is your nature, it's time to go against your nature in part. Okay. So then we continue on. In between those two, I just want to go over verse 28. It says, "And the waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen, the entire force of Pharaoh coming after them into the sea. Not even one of them survived." And so there's an interesting take on this front in Midrash Rabbah, where we see that the Egyptians were cunning. We saw this in previous parshas, where the Egyptians note that we should deal with the people of Israel cunningly or wisely. They were cunning people, and so their idea was that they were safe in regard to the Yam Suf. So why were they safe? Why was this the smart course of action? They could have pursued the people of Israel at any time. Why pursue them here at Yam Suf? And the reason was because Hashem had promised that he would never again cause a flood. That the flood would not be a means for Hashem to pursue. And so the Egyptian people thought that they were safe. They could traverse the land that was there at the Yam Suf, and they wouldn't be at risk because of Hashem's promise. But this is something that Hashem created personally for the Egyptians. So it wasn't a flood to cover the land or to wipe out everything. This is something personal to the Egyptians. And it has an interesting tie to the commandment that you shouldn't tempt Hashem. So in a sense, that's what the Egyptians were doing. They were essentially saying to Hashem, okay, you've promised that you weren't going to flood the land, and we're going to go across the land, and what are you going to do about it, essentially? And so they broke this command not to tempt Hashem, and it's also tied closely with humility. This mitzvot is very closely tied to humility. It's almost as if the Egyptian people were saying, we are so wise and so clever. As I said, they're essentially saying to Hashem, what are you going to do about it? We are more powerful in our cleverness than you are, Hashem. And so they lacked the humility. They found themselves superior to Hashem. Okay. So that was the parting of Yam Suf. And we continue on to the beginning of the time in the wilderness. And so we go to chapter 15. And so I'd like to call attention to verse 25. And verse 25 reads, "So he cried out to Hashem, and Hashem instructed him concerning a piece of wood, which he cast into the water, and the water became sweet. There he gave them a statute and an ordinance, and there he tested them." So this is really interesting. There are essentially 3 commandments that are given here, which is interesting that there's also a statute and an ordinance, and he tested them. So in a way, there's a reference to 3 right there. But essentially, at this point, we have 10 mitzvot or 10 commandments. We have the 7 Noahide laws from the sons of Noah, and then here we have social law, observing of Shabbos, and honoring the parents. So those are the 3 additional that are given here at this point. So we have 10 mitzvot here. And then we continue on to verse 26, and it reads, "And he said, if you hearken to the voice of the Lord, and you do what is proper in his eyes, and you listen closely to his mitzvot, and observe all his statutes, all the sickness that I have visited upon Egypt, I will not visit upon you, for I, the Lord, heal you. And so this is interesting. Hashem notes that there in the future will be no intent to just merely punish as he did with the Egyptians. And so what he's not saying is he's not saying that you won't have any problems going forward. There won't be any issues, any trials or tribulations. What he says specifically is that all the sickness that I've visited upon Egypt, I will not visit upon you. And so there's a distinction here between the way he treated the Egyptians and the way he handled the Egyptians. Distinction between that and the people of Israel. And what that idea is that, as I said, it won't just merely be punishment for the sake of punishment, but that there's a positive aspect to that. And we discussed this a few minutes ago in regard to finances and things of that nature, just as an example. But the idea here is that the suffering is of a positive nature. There's a positive reason for it. Not that we can understand that reason, but what's important is that we have faith that there is a positive reason for it. And so in this way, Hashem draws that distinction, and it's really interesting at the very end, this word Rafecha, that Hashem will be a healer. And it calls to mind an interesting statement that I heard a few days ago, this idea of a healer, because somebody was saying, what is the difference between a person with a knife and a doctor with a scalpel? Essentially, they are doing and committing the same thing. What's the difference? One is that a person with a knife is there to do harm, and a doctor with a scalpel is there to perform a surgical procedure in order to help somebody. And so it was very interesting, this coincidence that Hashem notes that he will heal you. And as I said, this doesn't say how that will be done. And that, just like a surgical procedure, there could be a lot of pain and a lot of suffering in that healing. But the reason why the surgical procedure is done in the first place is for that ultimate healing, for that ultimate betterment and improvement. And so, as I said, that's what we're really talking about with regard to Hashem. We're talking about an overall better place, not just the individual instance. Okay. So we continue on. And we come to chapter 16. And as I said, this is where we begin the time in the wilderness, the 40 years in the wilderness. And verse 4 says, So Hashem said to Moshe, Behold, I am going to rain down for you bread from heaven, and the people shall go out and gather what is needed for the day, so that I can test them whether or not they will follow my teaching. So the end of this verse, this word is interesting, Betorati. And so what teaching is Hashem referring to? Is he referring to the teaching that he's going to rain down bread from the heaven and see how the people of Israel react? Or is he actually referring to the Torah itself, the Torah T? That's noted here. And so perhaps this test was an idea or an instance or a foreshadowing to give Hashem a sense of whether or not the people of Israel are indeed the ones to receive the Torah. So I thought that was really interesting. Also, this idea of having the daily raining down of the bread from heaven. This idea is going to be a daily event, and speaks to the idea of a daily reward versus a sporadic reward. And there's a lot of commentary regarding the person who receives a reward once a year, and they're so grateful for this reward, but they're only grateful once a year when the reward comes around. And then after that, the newness loses its luster and people return to their own ways. So it highlights the importance of this idea of a daily reward, something that we're constantly rewarded with, so that it doesn't lose its luster, it doesn't get old. It's a constant blessing for us as a reminder of our relationship with Hashem. And so we see this in our daily lives in regard to study and prayer and the Torah in and of itself. We don't take out the Torah once a year and read it. We don't. We daven daily throughout the day. We study day after day after day. We don't just say, okay, on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, I'm gonna go to shul and I'm going to study and I'm going to daven, because this sporadic, not consistent reward isn't what Hashem has chosen for us. What Hashem has chosen for us is the daily rewards of study and prayer and the givings of the Torah. It should be a daily part of our lives so that it maintains that newness and that attractiveness. So we have the example right here in the Parsha. Okay. So we continue on, and we focus a great deal on the sustenance here in the wilderness. And so if we go to verse 32, it reads, Moshe said, "This is the thing that the Lord commanded. Let 1 omerful of it be preserved for your generations, in order that they see the bread that I fed you in the desert when I took you out of the land of Egypt." And so there's an interesting idea that in the wilderness, it was easy to receive those daily rewards, to have the consistent gratification. Every morning you would have the sustenance for the day. And so it's very hard to forget where that's coming from. And so this is the idea of it being preserved for the generations, in that it should be preserved for even those of us who are hundreds of generations removed. We still have the daily gifts that are preserved for us. And we see the daily gifts if we open our eyes and our hearts to those daily gifts. Every day we receive daily gifts. We receive all kinds of blessings that ultimately are rooted in Hashem. And sometimes that's difficult for us to see, because we don't have bread coming from the heavens. And so a lot of times we work and we toil for our earnings, and we have the things that we have in our life from that work and from that toiling. And so it's very easy to say, well, where did the things that I have in my life come from? Well, they came from me. I went to work every day. I worked and I paid my bills and I bought my groceries and I've provided everything for myself. And so this generational sustenance is a reminder, just as I said, the prayer and the study is a reminder that everything we have ultimately comes from the source of the divine, comes from Hashem. Hashem is the one that that allowed these things and have these things in place. So I could very easily say, well, yes, I went to work today, and so I earned a paycheck, and that allowed me to buy groceries, but it was because of my work. Well, the question is, why do I have that work? Well, because I went out and got it. Why did I go out and get that work? Because there was an inspiration in me that is my path, that is the right thing to do, and who ultimately provided that? Where did that come from? That came from Hashem. And so it's very easy for us to kind of muddy the waters and not really dig deep and see where things come from. Where do things come from? Ultimately, at the end of the day, they come from Hashem. It's very easy for us to say, oh, well, I'm alive because I breathe and my body breathes for me, and it's almost taken for granted. But to an extent, we should also acknowledge that every breath we have is a gift from Hashem. And the fact that we exist is a gift from Hashem. That's the beginning of Bereshit. It doesn't say that anyone else created everything except for Hashem. And so everything that we have in our lives ultimately was created by Hashem. From a scientific sort of standpoint, it's analogous to the idea that matter can't be created or destroyed. So everything that we have in our lives, everything in on this planet, at one point wasn't here; it was elsewhere in the universe, and even the different molecules that we're made out of came from another part in the universe. It wasn't just here, and nobody created it. But if you go back further, essentially, everything is created by Hashem. And so that scientific explanation has a close tie-in with the belief system, in that everything ultimately comes from Hashem. Hashem is the creator, the only creator. So as I was saying, this generational gift is a reminder of that, a reminder of where ultimately everything comes from. So we continue on, and we come to the battle with Amalek. And so this is in chapter 17, and it says in verses, we'll go 7 and 8, he named the place Massa and Meribah because of the quarrel of the children of Israel, and because of their testing the Lord, saying, is the Lord in our midst or not? Amalek came and fought with Israel in Rephidim. And so this is a lot of what we've been discussing over the course of this parsha, this idea of the quarreling of the children of Israel, and really what this all feeds to is doubt. And that is what Amalek is. Amalek really at the core embodies the doubt and the lack of faith. And this is really important. The reason why is because this doubt is what can allow us to ignore all the mitzvot, all the commandments, and ultimately even the existence of Hashem. So this doubt is something that's very powerful. And it's interesting that this follows right on the heels of the Exodus from Eretz Mitzrayim, where we saw aspects of this in Pharaoh, and then we have Amalek, who is a full embodiment of this doubt. And I would make the argument that there is really nothing else that is as powerful or as destructive as doubt. Because as I said, that can allow you to ignore essentially all of existence, ignore Hashem, and ignore the mitzvot. And what that does is that creates the concealment of Hashem and Hashem's divine light. And so when all of that is denied, we can look at other mitzvot, but really this doubt can just wipe everything out. So if there's some mitzvot that you didn't follow properly, or that she didn't perform. To a large part, that's focused with that mitzvot, and there can be some discussion about that, but really it's focused with that mitzvot. But this doubt can all at once eradicate all the mitzvot and the existence of Hashem. So that's why Amalek, this ultimate negativity, is tied to doubt. And so the people of Israel battle with Amalek. And verse 11 reads, "It came to pass that when Moshe would raise his hand, Yisrael would prevail. And when he would lay down his hand, Amalek would prevail." And so this idea of Moshe raising his hands and lowering his hands is really interesting. And so there's a lot of discussion that it doesn't have to do with the position of Moshe's hands. It wasn't when he raised his hands, then the people of Israel were successful, and when he lowered them, they weren't. And so we see this when we see that Moshe selected men for whom to do battle. And so if we go back to verse 9, it says, "So Moshe said to Joshua, 'Pick men for us and go out and fight against Amalek.'" So Moshe went to Yehoshua and picked out men. Why would there be a need to pick out men if the entire battle was dependent on the position of his hands? Theoretically, if Moshe wanted to, he could send women and children into battle against Amalek and raise his hands, and they would be successful. It wouldn't matter. So why this need to pick out skilled fighters? Well, the reason being is that it doesn't, as I said, it doesn't have to do with the position of his hands. What it had to do with was that the people, the combatants, the fighters would look to Moshe, and when they would see his hands in the air, within them, that would inspire them. That would inspire their hearts, because they understood that that was the connection to Hashem, and with that connection to Hashem, they were in their hearts invincible. They were on the right path, and they were doing what they were supposed to do. His hands down, that went away. They became disheartened and would be defeated. So it's not about the position of Moshe's hands; it's what it does for the people. And again, we can see that in our daily activities. Our life isn't necessarily strictly determined by whether we have our hands up or whether we have them down, whether we do this, whether we do that. What our life is about is what others look to, what the people around us look to, what they perceive. And so by being on the path that is designated for us, and other people seeing that inspires other people, and that brings those around us to a better place. So that's the conclusion of this week's Parsha. So let's do a little bit of discussion about some overall meanings that we can take away. The first thing I want to look at is this idea that the people are constantly crying out to Hashem. It's stated many times in the Parsha that people cried out to Hashem, and Moshe cried out to Hashem. After all of these miracles that we recount every year during Pesach when we sing Dayenu, we recount all these miracles, and yet the people are still crying out. And so it's important for us to understand that we need to look at what we have in front of us, the positive, great, miraculous wonders that we have in front of us, and acknowledge those. And we we do that on a daily basis during the shacharit prayers, when we're reciting modim and things like that. We do, but we need to recognize how many great and wonderful things we have around us, and how there are people that are in true need that don't get to experience necessarily all the wonders that we have in our own life. Sometimes it's good to watch a documentary or get involved with different community groups or things like that, because it's important to recognize that we have a great many miracles in our midst, and we have miracles that we can perform for those around us and for our community. But we should really take a look at our own lives and recognize how blessed we are on a daily basis. And that kind of ties into the idea of tzedakah, is that we give to tzedakah to because we're blessed with miracles, so many miracles, to the extent that it can be overflowing. We're overflowing with miracles, and they need to be shared with everybody. Everyone needs to experience the daily miracles, just like they're experiencing the daily manna and receiving sustenance. So that's one aspect. The other thing that I want to discuss was the idea of the 4 groups at the Yam Suf. And so, as I said, the interpretation, generally speaking, is that there are 4 groups. And these 4 groups of people, these are the categories that there were. There was the group, as we said earlier, the group that want to go into the Yam Suf and sacrifice themselves. And then the next group we have is a group that advocated returning to Eretz Mitzrayim. They said, this is too difficult. Let's just go back to Eretz Mitzrayim and we'll live as slaves, but we'll be alive. There's another group that wanted to wage war with the soldiers of Egypt. They said, you know what? It's better for us to fight. We'll wage the war, and that's the best way to go. And then the 4th group, I read numerous different interpretations of this. One interpretation being there would be a group that would pray to Hashem and hopefully attain salvation through the works of Hashem yet again. Another interpretation is that the 4th group is a group that would make so much commotion and so much ruckus that it would distract and confuse the Egyptian people. So a couple interpretations on that last group. But essentially, what we can infer from these groups is 4 different aspects of ways to approach these obstacles or these things that are standing in the way. And ultimately, what the Parsha says is that none of them are really the way to go. The first group willing to go into the sea, what we're looking at here is, although their intentions were noble in respect to the self-sacrifice that we discussed earlier, it's also avoiding reality. And there's a correlation that's made between the people going into the sea and the person that will just bury themselves in study and prayer and not acknowledge the rest of the world around them. There are definitely problems, issues, obstacles in the world around us, and you can't just shut your eyes to that and bury yourself in study. And we discussed this in the previous Parsha. We don't just turn a blind eye to things that are going around us. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the group that advocated for returning to Eretz Mitzrayim. And so it's also important that we don't just succumb to the world around us. We still have to remain firm. We can't just say, we'll just go along with that. And although it's not the optimal situation, it's definitely the easiest situation. Let's pursue that route. And so that's definitely giving in and succumbing to those obstacles and those pressures. We had the group that wanted to wage war, and that just signifies, fighting against the obstacles. And then the last group is another embodiment of escape, whether it be a spiritual escape and in requesting that Hashem deliver. But although these may seem an appropriate response, and any one of these people could advocate, these are 4 different groups, you could have any response. None of them are really a tenable solution. And these 4 groups are interesting. What it teaches us is that there are there are different interpretations. People have different ideas of what the best way is to handle a hardship or an obstacle. There are different aspects to different people. I mean, different people will interpret things differently. Pardon me. And we see this in the study of Torah. There are different aspects to Torah that different people can interpret differently. Obviously, we've been doing it for thousands of years. There's a lot of different interpretations. So it acknowledges that difference in the people. There's a difference that people possess. And I've made the argument previously that people will say, well, Torah was written by a number of different authors, at least 4 that we know of. I think it's 4. Saying that, look, this writing style is like this, and this writing style is like that, and this writing style is like this. And I've made the argument that just because a writing style is different doesn't mean that there's a different author. And for me, just because there's a different writing style doesn't negate the existence of Hashem or the idea that Hashem, gave the Torah to the people of Israel. But you can write in different ways depending on the audience that you're speaking with. So, for example, if I'm writing a little note to a child, the way that I speak and the way that I write is going to be a lot different from if I'm writing a letter to an attorney, per se. There's going to be totally different writing styles. Nowadays, look at our text messages. Everything's in shorthand and there's little bits of words and this and that, and it's understood by the reader who's going to receive the message. But that's not the same message that I would write to a politician or a medical professional or things like that, any kind of professional. I wouldn't have little bits of words and things like that. So we can very easily change our writing style and adapt it to who's going to be receiving it. So as I said, we acknowledge that there are different people with different views, different interpretations, and these 4 groups represent the idea of this variation that can exist amongst one people, the people of Israel, and you still have all this variation. So what is the correct response? We've got these 4 groups. Which one is correct? Well, the correct one was the response of Moshe, and that was to continue on and follow the path. He said the people who want to go into the sea, into Yam Suf, that's not going to work. Hashem will be there for you. For those who want to succumb and return to Eretz Mitzrayim, Moshe said, you're never going to see the people of Egypt this way again. For those who want to wage war, Moshe said, Hashem will fight for you. So in all these instances, Moshe's path was the one to follow. And that was following the will of Hashem, following the template that Hashem provided in the Torah. That's the correct path. And so we look to the Torah as that path, as that guide for the different situations. And why do we do that? Well, as I said, we have these 2 souls. We have the animal soul and we have the divine soul that are can oftentimes be contradictory. And which one do we follow? Which one do we even know is acting at that point? So if we face an obstacle and we say, for example, taking the 3rd group, the right path to follow is to fight this obstacle. Well, what's saying fight the obstacle? Is that the animal soul focused on self-preservation and self-gratification? Or is that the divine soul saying this is the correct path to take? But we're blessed with a Torah. We're blessed with a template of what the right path is. And we are blessed with the divine inspiration and divine intervention that will allow us, as long as we maintain the faith that Hashem will provide for us, and that Hashem will provide the footsteps for us to take. Again, just as we say in the shacharit prayers, that Hashem strengthens our footsteps. If we follow that path and focus on our true goals, again, not the goals of the animal soul, but the true goals of our divine soul, that would be the correct response to the obstacles and the tribulations that we face. All right, so I'd like to thank you again for joining us for this week's Parsha discussion. Please feel free to leave a comment. Also, if you'd like to make a donation, there's a link to our Patreon page in the description below, as well as on the channel homepage, and we greatly appreciate any donations. Please join us for the morning shacharit prayers. We do them on Monday through Friday at 6 AM Pacific Standard Time. And then just as today, please join us for our weekly Parsha discussion at noon Pacific Standard Time. Again, I thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you have a day filled with blessings.